2024 marks the 20th anniversary of the SubCultures Art of the Action Figure exhibit. This little-known gallery show collected the works of many a toy artist, which at the time was a sort of new, exciting avenue of creative expression. Some of the participants in the show went on to reach incredible heights, and others faded away into obscurity. For me personally, it represents a catalyst moment in my life. After the exhibit opened, my life would never be the same, and I feel very fortunate to be sitting where I am because of this show. But the story really starts in 2002, when I went into Tate's Comics in Fort Lauderdale. It's still there, by the way, fantastic store. And I bought this very odd-looking magazine, and I had no idea what was in it. It was wrapped in plastic, and much to my surprise, it was this really wonderful catalog of all these different Hong Kong artists that were essentially on the cutting edge of what we would call art toys. Now, by art toys, I essentially mean toys that are not based on a famous intellectual property, but rather come from a single creative vision, and more often than not reflect the culture around the artist rather than the pop culture around the globe. I was just a broke college student, so this magazine was quite a treat for me. Although I did have aspirations of entering into the toy industry, I really had no idea how I was going to make that happen for myself. But flipping through this book, it became clear to me that these artists were onto something. They were making sculptures and they were making figures based on their day-to-day life, not based on the stories of movie studios or comic books or other people's tales. And within that premise, I felt a grand provocation. I felt like, yes, this is how I can express myself in the world. I love toys. I love customizing figures. I will use the medium of toys to represent the world as I see it, the characters in my head, the people in my life. And that is where the idea of the SubCultures Art of the Action Figure exhibit came to be. The genesis point of the art toy movement is a bit obscured by time, but generally people seem to point to two Hong Kong-based artists, Eric So and Michael Lau. Funny story, a few years later, after the exhibit had opened, I was in Hong Kong working for a toy company, and I actually met Eric So, got to tour his apartment, got to see a lot of these original creations. It was quite a treat. It's also interesting to note that I think most people associate toys with Japan, but here was a pretty distinct movement that was happening in Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong, great place to buy toys, huge toy culture, but probably much smaller than the toy culture of Japan. I personally point to Hong Kong as being more of a genesis point for this idea compared to Japan, because Hong Kong is much more international in its influences. In fact, as you look through this magazine, you can see a lot of the ideas and the tropes and the traits of the characters depicted here are sort of a Hong Kong person's translation of American culture, whether it's hip-hop culture, graffiti culture, whatever the case may be. A lot of Japanese art, a lot of Japanese anime, manga, toy design are self-referential and represent Japanese sensibilities. Compare that to Hong Kong with their international flair. I think you understand why there's a distinct difference in aesthetics. It's been more than a decade since I flipped through this magazine, and I have to say the most striking thing about looking at these pictures is how little the idea of quote-unquote art toys has changed in 20 years. If you look on the store shelves, everything is exactly the same. It is sort of a movement of the late 90s, early 2000s, and the aesthetics got locked in place, and very little has challenged the look and the feel of these toys from where we stand 2 decades later. And if I ever see another action figure that has any component of a spray can involved in it, I'm just going to puke on my beautiful white tracksuit. A couple of disclaimers before we get to the actual exhibit itself. First and foremost, I do not claim to have made any contribution whatsoever to the world of art toys. I'm simply laying out what my personal journey has been. There are institutions like Medicom, Kid Robot, Toy Tokyo that were loudly spreading the gospel of this aesthetic long before I came on the scene. If anything, my journey represents when suburban kids started to gain some exposure to this potent art aesthetic. I was not an innovator in any aspect, nor did I contribute in any meaningful way to the dispersion of the idea of art toys in a bigger way. I was already pretty late on the scene by the time this exhibit kicked off. It's also worth noting, between the time it took to book the gallery space and actually put the show on, I had been hired as an intern and then a paid intern at an actual toy company. This allowed me to go to San Diego Comic-Con, where I met many of the artists that I would feature in the art show. So that is a totally convergent lucky break that happened while I was toiling under this idea of putting on an art exhibit. I had contributed to a student art show, I think in my sophomore year, in which I covered one side of the gallery in the backer cards from action figures. And it was a big installation, and people seemed to be relatively intrigued by it. But I struck up a friendship with the very nice lady running the gallery, and that allowed me to sort of pitch the idea of them giving me the entire gallery, which is sort of insane for somebody who wasn't even a senior at that point, or had any sort of notable work that they had produced. But they did take a chance on me, and so I went about collecting as many different artists as I could to contribute work to the show. The majority of artists that I reached out to said no, right? They were busy displaying their works in Paris, displaying their works in New York City, in San Francisco, or LA. An off-market place like Fort Lauderdale didn't seem to impress them, and hey, maybe they were right. The people that did say yes tended to be younger artists closer to my age, who maybe had not yet broken out in a big way. And I think at the end of the day, that made for this exhibit to be even more potent. Despite this being one of the worst flyer designs of all time, the credit due to me, I think you can see a pretty impressive roster of people that agreed to be involved. We have Casey Lau, who was a Hong Kong upstart. I believe Casey is now deep in the world of the startup culture over there, but he produced the DV Ants, which I really liked and I don't think got their due. Nathan Juravicius, if I'm saying that name correctly, who has gone on to quite an illustrious career in animation, amongst other things. Tim Biscup, who at that point was already a really well-established artist, was gracious enough to donate pieces as well. The biggest get of the show was probably David Horvath and Ugly Dolls. At that point, they were gaining quite a bit of heat on them. They had not yet done a 3D movie or some of the larger licensing plays that they would do in the years that followed. But there was definitely a feeling of Ugly Dolls being domestically the heavy hitter in this kind of, again, I hate using the term, but art toys world. David, who's always been very nice and very kind to me, even flew in with Sun Min to the opening. They came into the gallery before the opening, got themselves some crackers and some cheese, added a very charming drawing to our mural wall, and then promptly excused themselves, left, and never came back. I'm going to chalk it up to having jet lag, let's say that. Or perhaps they were horrified by their lovely creations being impaled. Friends with You, who were cool South Florida art kids, they graciously participated in the show. At that point, they were just kind of rough and tumble, scrappy artists like myself. They went on to have an incredible career working for Nicky, working for Skrillex, the guy with the big hat, Pharrell. I believe they even had their own Friends with You float in the Thanksgiving Day parade. Mr. Banwai J, who at the time was just inking a deal with Hasbro to bring his Stick Fuzz into the mass market, graciously donated some of his original creations. I wonder whatever happened to that guy, allegedly. Never mind. There were also contributions from Sucklord, Ann Tran and David Mack. Ann would become a bigger player in the second show, by the way. Achy Breaky Toys, Critta's, Iron Cow Production, Art Asylum, and another big personal get, Evan Dorkin. He designed some Mini-Mates based on his artwork. I was a huge milk and cheese fan as a kid. This was a big deal to me. And they were handcrafted by Iron Cow Productions, who then went on to work for Art Asylum, designing a whole ton of mini-mates. Plan B Toys played a special role in the SubCultures Art of the Action Figure because they produced for me the Rex Gannon exclusive action figure. This was my own personal creation. I hunted them down at San Diego Comic-Con, got introduced by a mutual friend, the old Betts, and forced my will upon them to become friends. They were either very gracious and good at pretending or genuinely interested in my idea of SubCultures and agreed to participate and come out for the opening. Alongside that, they loaned me the body for one of their Special Forces figures and even put me in touch with a sculptor who could sculpt Rex Gannon, my childhood character creation. Funny enough, a few years back, the entire inventory of Rex Gannon figures would be found in a warehouse in Ohio and sent to me. And so you can pick up a Rex Gannon SubCultures exclusive figure from 2002 very cheaply on my website as we speak. Leading up to the opening of the show, I had actually left my job at Play Along Toys. And this was a job where I started working for free, managed to con my way into a paid position. Then as the demands of SubCulture became bigger for me, I promptly left that job. This golden opportunity very few people get, I walked right away from. So during the opening of this show, I was flat broke, no employment, solely focused on putting this art exhibit up and feeling really unbearable pressure upon myself. During one of the final days of setup prior to the opening, I got a call on my cell phone from a local CEO who ran a toy company that was making Mega Man figures. This would be Jazzwares. They had read about the exhibit. We agreed that I would come in and meet them after the exhibit had happened, and that, of course, would lead me to my second gig in the toy industry. By the end of the show, I had sold, I think, one painting and maybe 5 or 6 Rex Gannon figures. There was going to be no remuneration for me in the large sums of money that I had sunk into the exhibit. But I had already booked another show in Miami, and I had interest in another art institute in Portland putting on the exhibit as well. That, along with this new potential to be working for Jazzwares, gave me a pretty rosy outlook on life. The first show was done and over with, and while it was not a monetary success by any means, it did put me on certain people's radar, and that opened up new opportunities. The show, which started in Fort Lauderdale, got an invitation to Miami, an invitation to Portland, and an invitation to New Haven, Connecticut. Now I'm going to jump around and go out of order here because I think really Portland is the more significant of these shows. Chronologically, the next show was Miami, and the less that's said about that show, the better. I do not consider that to be a fun or successful venture, and ultimately ended up butting heads with the gallery owner. So, again, the less said, the better. Let's move on. The final show was in New Haven, Connecticut, and that was curated by Matt Connolly. You're going to meet him in just a moment. And while it was a very valiant effort, we did not have an entire dedicated gallery space. So for me, this ends up being just a sort of minor footnote. The event that I really want to focus on is the Portland exhibit. It was through the network of Art Institute galleries that I was able to make the show happen. I'd never been to Portland, I'd never been to the Pacific Northwest, so I was very much looking forward to this event. While I felt like Miami was a bit of a stumble, getting back to a proper AI gallery seemed like the logical next step. The crew for this show was much more lean and much more sort of people I was personally friendly with. Tran continued on with Tranimals, which, I don't know if that name would be used by today's standards, but that's her last name and that's what she called the line. An was a blast to work with. She helped out big time in the setup and just generally was a nice person to be around. In researching for this video, I did actually find one of her San Diego Comic-Con exclusive Tranimals that we had worked together on through Tower Records, which was around back in the day. And it was such a crazy blast from the past to see this. As I said earlier, at this time I had been hired and was working for Jazzwares. And part of what I was doing for Jazzwares was the tour circuit, San Diego Comic-Con, and other events, much like I had done back in the play-along days. Going on this sort of road tour, I got to meet a lot of different people, and that's where I met a couple indie comic artists, Jeffrey Brown and Craig Thompson. Craig had just had a major hit on his hands with the huge tome Blankets, very sweet guy, and Jeffrey Brown was also making massive strides. He would later go on to do a series of immensely popular Star Wars books. My love for the sort of autobiographical comics of that era really inspired me to want to collaborate with these guys and get them involved in the next SubCultures exhibit. With Craig being a Portland native, it seemed to make total sense. Also from the tour days, Matt Connolly, formerly of McFarlane Toys, became quite a close friend of mine, and he still is to this day. He is a current Squire of the Slice in good standing, and a member of my quite popular Patreon, patreon.com/Jesse DeStasio. Matt took a very active role in the planning of this show, and that led to him being assigned as curator for the New Haven show. Matt unveiled his creation, the Ninja Bread Man. This was such a sensitive, such a transgressive, such a bold statement that many world governments attempted to silence Matt Connolly for his stunning piece of work. Rounding out the cast was Mark Bodnar and Trevor Zammit with their Sheet Ghost creations, and I got to be friends with them throughout San Diego Comic-Con. We'll get back to Trevor towards the end of the video. The final ingredient, another Portland native, was an artist named Bwana Spoons. Now, Bwana today is probably one of the most prolific independent vinyl and toy makers that's out there. He is well regarded in the designer con scene and is just a workhorse. The guy has dedicated his life to creating toys of his inner creations, and you really got to applaud him for that. The staple of this exhibit was a very beautiful mural that 5 or 6 of us collaborated on. Much to my chagrin, I do not seem to have a clear picture of this mural, but it was really a beautiful work of art. You'll also notice there's no video footage of any of this. This was pre-camera phones, if you can believe it. David Horvath contributed his new line Numa, which were super cute and more importantly could not be nailed to the gallery wall. As far as my contribution, I had a theme of Rex Gannon on Mars. And this is a theme that's come back in present day in the Night of the Slice toy line. I've done several homages to this period. Looking at old art is always sort of painful and cringy for most people. And I visited my DeviantArt page, which I don't think I've looked at in a couple decades. But I think ultimately there's something mildly interesting to these pieces. I was really using a lot of found material, a lot of broken lucite panels, and I was getting very sort of viscous and down and dirty with my painting style. There's a lot of work I've done in the past that I never want to see again and I'm not particularly proud of. This stuff I think is okay. There were Rex Gannon custom action figures made by Joe Amaro, who also tackled bringing Jeffrey Brown's Big Head character into the 3D form. The opening was a real smash hit, and for me, there was one personal moment that was deeply meaningful to me. I met an older gentleman, and he explained that he was Will Vinton, and he had created the California Raisins, and he ran a stop-motion animation studio. But I had a really wonderful conversation with him, and he was such a huge impact on my childhood. It was just one of those great moments. If you look at my face in the photos of this opening, you can tell something's not quite right. I was suffering from some unknown stomach illness. I gritted my teeth and bared it for the week. When I got back to Florida, I almost immediately ended up in the emergency room where I was diagnosed with gastritis. Illness aside, it was an extremely positive event. Again, nobody bought anything, but at this point, I was well used to that. My responsibilities at Jazzwares and then my eventual move to New York City really prevented me from focusing on a show that took a tremendous amount out of me, in some cases landing me in the ER. I think the show wound down when it needed to. I think it existed when it made sense, and it sunsetted at the appropriate time. I would go on to dabble with my own solo art exhibits in small places, as well as focusing on the Night of the Slice line and collaborating with clutter gallery. But Subcultures will always hold a special place in my heart because it happened prior to me having anything to do with the toy industry. I ended up getting a foot in the door through sheer coincidence, but this was going to be my sort of opening volley into the world as a toy creator. Out of everybody that I had the joy to work with, I think the most successful toy designer from the entire Subculture stable would have to be Trevor Zaman. This is probably not the person you're expecting me to point out, but Trevor went on to work for NECA, and he became the brand manager for Ninja Turtles. And through Trevor's perseverance, he has tackled our friends in green in so many different iterations with such nuance and such detail, whether it's the Archie comic line or the video game colorways, and the figures are in nearly every store you go in. So in terms of sheer visibility, sheer amount of units shipped, sheer creativity, granted, these are not original creations, but you still have to give it to Trevor. Subcultures never changed the world, never really introduced anybody on a massive scale to a new design or aesthetic. It was more a personal love letter to the things that I saw that were new and exciting and that I loved. And it's a very interesting mile marker for me and my life and my career. Today, I'm lucky enough to only focus on my own creative projects. Rex Gannon, he's alive and well. There's been countless editions of him, and I'm continuing to carry the torch for that kid 20 years ago who didn't know any better, who bit off more than he could chew, who just wanted to make toys of his ideas. And if any of this is even mildly interesting to you and you'd like to learn more, you can follow me on patreon.com/Jesse DeStasio, where I continue telling that story I started so many years ago. This has been Jesse DeStasio, the 20th anniversary of the Subcultures Art of the Action Figure exhibit, signing off.